If we could have everybody take their seats, we'd like to welcome you today to something new in AGU. We're actually seeking to start today what we hope will become an annual event to have a special lecture on topics of emerging interest in the global environmental change sciences. And this is our very first in this series this year. As I mentioned, it's sponsored by the Global Environmental Change Focus Group, but it's also co-sponsored by 8 of the other 22 AGU sections and focus groups. That may be a record, I'm not sure. I am not any of the 3 co-hosts that you'll find in the official program, Steve Lloyd, Molly Brown, or Fegan Makic. Unfortunately, they were not able to be here, so substituting today for you is the AGU Global Environmental Change Focus Group web editor. My name is Chuck Hakkarainen. I am a scientist, retired scientist. And today we're going to have the first in these series of talks on the subject of ocean acidification, consequences of excess carbon dioxide in the marine environment. Our speaker today is Dr. Ken Caldera. He is a professor in the Department of Global Ecology, Carnegie Institution of Washington, and a professor by courtesy in the Department of Environmental Earth System Sciences at Stanford University, just a few miles down the road from where we are. Dr. Caldera received his PhD in atmospheric sciences from New York University in 1991, and prior to joining Stanford, he worked 12 years at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I have met him once before in my career, 12 years ago. He participated in a special session at the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography in Honolulu on the subject of ocean sequestration of carbon. One of the things I remember from that session was that there were 3 Kens who spoke during that session, and I only remember the name of Ken Caldera, so he obviously was the best of the 3 and is the appropriate person to speak to us today. And his paper is entitled Ocean Acidification, Adaptive Challenge or Extinction Threat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Caldera.
Well, first let me start off by saying it's a real honor to be invited to speak to you all today. I look out into the audience and I see a number of people who are more qualified to give this talk than I am, so it's nice to think that I might even be in the same league, although that's questionable. So, and also I'd like to just at the outset thank some of my collaborators, some of whose work I'm presenting today, Kate Rickey, current postdoc, Long Kao, former postdoc, Kenny Schneider and Jack Silverman, who've been leading field work in my group. And anyway, I'd just like to thank them. So here we go. Click left button on the mouse. So I'm going to start off with a little cartoon about carbonate chemistry. I was told to make this talk suitable for non-specialists. And I'll do my best to do that, although every once in a while we'll get a little bit technical. But we'll start out with this cartoon about carbonate chemistry. And so here we see H2O, which is water. And then there's this HCO3 minus, which is what marine chemists call bicarbonate ions. And then that CO3 2 minus, which are carbonate ions. And then you see this calcium carbonate. And that calcium carbonate in the oceans, there are 2 major forms of it, and one is called aragonite and one is called calcite. They're both calcium carbonate, but one is more soluble than the other. And one of the concerns is that as we add CO2 to the system, that the CO2 that we release to the atmosphere, most of it will ultimately be absorbed by the ocean, and that CO2, once it's in the ocean, reacts with seawater to become carbonic acid. And at the pH concentrations or the hydrogen ion activity levels in seawater, this molecule is unstable and a proton tends to come off. And that proton, so when we measure pH or we talk about pH, in seawater, we're talking about the activity or the concentration of that hydrogen ions. And just because chemists like to be confusing, they express that as the negative logarithm of the activity, which is called pH. So when we have more hydrogen ions in solution, we say the pH goes down. But one of the concerns is that this hydrogen ion is reactive, and one of the things it likes to react with are the carbonate ions. And so it reacts with the carbonate ion and forms another bicarbonate ion. And this changes the chemical equilibrium in the ocean, because calcium carbonate in the surface ocean, the precipitation of calcium carbonate is thermodynamically favored. But if you consume a bunch of those carbonate ions, then the solid form of calcium carbonate is no longer stable, and it tends to dissolve into carbonate ion and calcium ions. And so even in lower concentrations, the addition of CO2 might not cause the calcium carbonate to dissolve, but it can make it harder for the organism to produce a shell or skeleton of calcium carbonate. So, as a consequence, as the red line here shows CO2 from Mauna Loa in the atmosphere going up, and then the bluish line shows the partial pressure of CO2 measured in seawater at Station Aloha. And then the green line is it's an indicator of this pH, or measurements of pH in the same seawater samples. And so it shows that pH goes down. And so this is an indicator that the basic theory is right, that as atmospheric CO2 goes up, some of the CO2 molecules go into the ocean, increase the partial pressure of CO2 in the ocean, and cause pH to go down, which is the hydrogen ion activity to go up. But in some of the kind of coarse resolution global modeling we're assuming that the chemistry of seawater is relatively spatially, very slowly spatially, but work by Dick Feely and others have shown that there's a lot of spatial variation in seawater chemistry. And here we're seeing the west coast of the United States. That's sort of Baja California in the lower right of the figure, and sort of northern Canada by the upper left. And this is showing the depth that you would have to go down to find waters that are undersaturated. I believe it's with respect to calcite. So one thing with just a basic sort of chemical oceanography thing, that the upper ocean is typically saturated with respect to carbonate minerals. So thermodynamically, the precipitation of carbonate minerals is favored in the surface ocean, whereas in the deep ocean, due to higher dissolved inorganic carbon concentration and pressure effects, the carbonate minerals tend to dissolve. And along the west coast of the United States, some of this deep water but the wind, as a result of the wind, some of this deep water comes up near the surface, and there are indications that sometimes some of these undersaturated deep waters are reaching the shoreline. And as the surface ocean becomes more and more acidic, or as the pH goes down, it's still above 7, so it's still alkaline waters, but it's becoming more acidic. The frequency with which these undersaturation events or low saturation events would impinge upon the coast will increase. And it's a little bit like this issue of this Sandy, where this recent storm that hit New York City, there's this question of, like, to what extent are these these storm events or these low saturation events the result of human interference in the system, and to what extent are they natural variability? And I think what we're seeing both with ocean acidification and with the severe storms is that the human imprint is moving the means, and so that extremes are becoming more extreme. And I think this is basically the same story with ocean acidification. So now this is, some years ago, a bunch of experiments had been done in inside laboratories looking at how rapidly corals calcify as a function of aragonite saturation. And what we mean here is it's basically aragonite saturation is an index of the chemical potential driving the precipitation of aragonite, of this calcium carbonate mineral. And what we see is that even though the calcification is going on behind membranes, the rates look fairly thermodynamic in the sense that if we took just a block of, if we just looked at minerals in pure water, we might expect from thermodynamics to see a curve something like this. Now, in the laboratory, you can actually dissolve the shells or the skeleton from a coral, and the polyp can survive. But that doesn't mean that it can survive ecologically when you have predation and various boring organisms eating away at your skeleton. And so, when you're on the right side of this figure in that pink area, you're in a zone where calcification exceeds bioerosion, and you would expect net accumulation of calcium carbonate in coral reefs. Whereas when you're on the left side of that figure, you might think that bioerosion might exceed the rate of calcification, and you might be losing the reefs. So, at that time of that figure was made, most of the experiments had been done in the laboratory and on a few species. And since that time, there's been a wide diversity of experiments, and many of them now moving out into the field and with mesocosms. This is work led by Ulf Riebesel and his colleagues with mesocosms. This one's in the Baltic Sea, but they've done it in a few other places. And now there have been a number of review papers on this topic, and I know this is probably too small for you to see from there, but this is, I think, what we'd call a meta-review paper, because it reviews 4 review papers and tries to summarize what they all concluded. But I'll just sort of blow up the upper left-hand corner of this to just focus on here calcareous algae, corals, foraminifera, mollusks, and coccolithophores, which are calcareous plankton, and focus on calcification. And as you can see, most of these arrows are pointed down, which means that the experiments and observations that have been made indicate that, as you would expect from thermodynamics, that as you increase the CO2 concentrations, that the rates of calcification go down. And there's all these experiments are not in all these reviews are not in total accord, but the general picture that at least for organisms that have where their skeletal mass is large compared to their body mass, and they're not carefully controlling the fluids flowing through them, that the increasing CO2 makes it harder for them to build their shells or skeletons. A few years ago, my postdoc at that time, Long Kao, and I did some climate model simulations, and what we did was we said, well, let's compare. Let's look at what the saturation state, again, this is the chemical potential that helps drive calcification by coral reefs, and let's plot that on top of the locations of reefs. And so these magenta dots are the locations of reefs from reef base, and these bars show the fraction of reefs that are in each category. And in this analysis, based on and we got this, so 280 there represents the partial pressure of atmospheric CO2 in pre-industrial times. And we got this map by taking the mid-1990s WOS/GLODAP estimates of alkalinity and dissolved inorganic carbon in the seawater, and then backed out what our model predicted changes were pre-industrial to present. And then plotted what fraction of the reefs are in each bin. And so we found there was just a few reefs between 3 and 3.25, and I think 2% of the reefs were between 3.25 and 3.5 saturated, but around 98% of the reefs were in open ocean waters that had saturation levels of 3.5 or greater. I would like to stress that this is open ocean waters. This model does not represent the kind of detailed coastal phenomena that Dick Feely observed in the slide that I showed earlier. And so then if we march forward 380, I think we're something like 394 today, so this is like a 2005 CO2 level, we see that already something on the order of half of the reefs are somewhere where only 2% of the reefs were a couple of hundred years ago. As you move to 450 ppm, 550 ppm, the overlap in the kind of chemistry of seawater that surrounded reefs basically no longer exists in the ocean. And as you get sort of towards the end of century business as usual conditions, you see that the seawater chemistry that had surrounded coral reefs for the last many thousands of years, if not many millions of years, basically no longer exists in the ocean. Now, there are controversies of the extent to which temperature, light, nutrients, other factors affect the distribution of corals. But, when you have a picture like this, where basically you're not seeing any corals, reefs, pre-industrially surrounded by open ocean waters less than, say, aragonite saturation 3.0, that the fact that we're moving to a situation where there's will be no reef in the world with waters surrounded by waters with that chemical composition, we have to at least say that the reefs are at risk. So, it's nice to run climate models, but it's also nice to get out in the field. And so we had this idea, and this is really work that was led in my group by Jack Silverman and Kenny Schneider, to go out and try to visit places where people measured the rate of reef calcification or estimated the rates of reef calcification a few decades ago and see how they're doing now. And so Donald Kinsey had done a number of reef metabolism studies. And these studies, there's different variants of the idea, but the basic idea is to treat the reef itself. It's kind of a geochemist's view of biology, where you treat the water on top of the reef as a black box, and you say, okay, here we'll measure the chemistry of the water coming in and the wet chemistry of the water going out. If you know the flow rates and the volumes and so on, you can just figure out, well, there needed to be a flux of so much per square meter at the base of it to make the chemistry balance. And so it's kind of a geochemist's black box view of biology. So we went back to two places and tried to reproduce as closely as we could measurements that Kinsey's group made in the 1960s. And so one set was going to Lizard Island. And again, so the water was flowing on. You can see the stations there, but basically the water was flowing from the lower right to the upper left. And so you measure the water chemistry as it flows onto that reef crest and as it flows off. And then by the difference, you see what the reef did. And this is just kind of a picture of some of the sampling here. That's, I think, Tanya Rivlin there. And so what we got was, what Kinsey came up with in 1975. We had two expeditions there and found basically a 40% reduction in net calcification since the 1970s. And I know that at least one of my co-authors gets annoyed every time I say this, but that, I think this is basically an anecdotal result in that, we probably I think we were not in the exact same place that Kinsey was, that our methods were changed a little bit. We don't know what kind of pH standards and other standards he used and so on. But, if you do the same thing in a bunch of places and you get the same results, an accumulation of anecdotal data, becomes something more than anecdotal with time. So then we also did a trip to One Tree Island, which is in the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef. And this reef has an interesting geometry because the reef crest around this lagoon forms kind of a bathtub. So at low tide, since the water is only flowing out over the reef crest, all the chemical changes in that lagoon have to be to do with exchange in the reef or air-sea gas exchange. And so this is a different method. You can just say, well, look, the chemical changes are due to either gas exchange or interaction with the reef because all the water is just flowing out and there's no inflow. So geometrically, it's a great place to do work, and it's also a fun place to do work. And so, we spent a month there and through 2 tidal cycles. At each low tide measured rates of reef calcification. And so one of the things we got was that there was a lot of calcification in the middle of the day and the afternoon, but a fair amount of dissolution going on at night. And dissolution at night was not something that Kinsey observed when he was there. And this Kenny Schneider, we won't say what he's putting into that DIC sample. But so what we found was that there was 60% less net calcification than in the 1970s, but the story was really complicated, and we really don't understand what was happening, because what we measured was more daytime calcification, but nighttime dissolution that was not observed by Kinsey. And so, just to say that things are more complicated, and as a modeler, it gives you good reason to stay out of the field. So anyway, we don't really know what's going on there, but that didn't stop us from publishing the paper. Okay. So now shifting timescales a little bit. One of the things you get talking about ocean acidification, people say, well, isn't, CO2 was high in the Cretaceous 100 million years ago when dinosaurs roamed the planet, and, there were plenty of reefs around, and life did fine, and so what are you worried about? And that's a legitimate question, and it has an answer. And this is a paper led by Andy Ridgewell some time ago talking about controls on ocean chemistry. And Dave Archer has really pioneered a lot of this work, looking at how interactions between the ocean and sediments acts to buffer ocean chemistry over longer time scales. And if you add CO2 to the oceans, it causes the deep ocean to become less saturated, which causes what's called the calcite and aragonite lysoclines to shoal, or to become shallower, and then carbonate sediments accumulate on a smaller fraction of the seafloor. Also, in shallow water environments, work by Brad Updike, and plus a lot of recent work on calcification, seems to indicate that shallow water environments also accumulate less calcium carbonate when saturation rates are low. And so this acts as a natural feedback, so that if you add more CO2, you remove less alkalinity, which you can think of as kind of antacid from the water, and it acts to buffer seawater chemistry. But the problem is that it takes many thousands of years for this process to affect seawater. You can think that the overturning time of the oceans on the scale of roughly 1,000 years, and it takes a while for just a parcel of water to contact the sediments so that the sediments could have some interaction on the chemistry. When we're putting out carbon on the time scale of decades or centuries, the water parcels don't have a chance to interact with the sediments. And so if we were putting out the same amount of carbon over many hundreds of thousands of years, it wouldn't be a big deal for ocean chemistry. But when we're putting out the carbon, in a decades or centuries, there's just not time for the sedimentary system to buffer the pH and saturation state of the ocean. I won't go into this figure, but let me just go to this one here. That right now, this shows for the global ocean model the depth of saturation. And so we're seeing on the left hand of these panels the year 2000, on the right hand year 3000. And right now, the depth to which the ocean is saturated with respect to calcite is greater than 4 kilometers. That if you see that even for stabilizing at 450 ppm, this saturation horizon shoals to less than 1 kilometer. So even stabilizing CO2 at relatively low levels causes this saturation horizon to come relatively shallow in the ocean. If we look at the depth of this saturation horizon over geologic time, here are the two figures showing over the last 50 million years. and this horizon has always been several kilometers deep in the ocean. And so that even a stabilization at, say, 400 and 550 ppm is introducing a chemical perturbation into the ocean that hasn't been seen for at least 50 million years. And so what we're doing in terms of the rapidity of change to ocean chemistry, changing it on a time scale where the sedimentary system doesn't have a chance to buffer the chemical changes, is producing a profound chemical change. And so this is really what's different between the geologic timescale changes and what we're doing. What we're doing is much faster. If we look at the, this is now a little bit old, but if we look at the Vostok record and then this Mauna Loa record, and we take the time derivative, it looks, similar orders of magnitude, and the lines look like they might be similar rates. But if we look at the rates from Mauna Loa, if we look at if we first take the glacial interglacial Vostok record, the rates of change are a few hundredths of a ppm per year, whereas the rates of change from the Mauna Loa record are a couple of ppm per year. And if we put them on the same same vertical scale, we can see that the atmospheric CO2 today is changing roughly 100 times more rapidly than the natural variation seen in the glacial interglacial cycles. And that factor of 100 is not that surprising, because if we think of what is the CO2 from volcanoes and mid-ocean ridges, it might be on the order of 1/10 of a petagram per year. Maybe it's a 0.2, but it's somewhere in that range. Whereas our emissions, this is now a couple of years old, but our emissions are on the order of 10 petagrams per year today. So 100 or at least 50 times the natural background CO2 emission rate. And so, it's not surprising that CO2 is changing, 50 or 100 times faster than we've seen through most of geologic time. This also suggests that if we reduce our emissions by a factor of 50 to 2% of what they are now, we would still be more than doubling the natural background emissions. And if we had sustained that in itself would be enough to produce Cretaceous-like climates, although it might take 1 million years or so to get there. So, we looked at this in a climate model situation, saying, well, how high might the CO2 go? And, there's I think this next IPCC report is going to say 12,000 petagrams of carbon are in fossil fuel, ultimately recoverable resources. But this question of how much fossil fuel is there is really an economic question, because there's something like 1 million petagrams of organic carbon in Earth's sedimentary shell, and it's a question of economics and engineering of what we'll eventually be able to get to. But so this is just one model prediction of CO2 levels for burning different amounts of CO2. If we put that glacial interglacial curve next to it and we try to put it on the same axis, it looks something like this. And so, what we're slated to see in the coming decade, the coming centuries under business as usual is really unusual, say, compared with glacial interglacial changes. But if we put those CO2 levels, and now I have to move to a log plot, to put those maximum CO2 levels for burning those different amounts of fossil fuel resources, and we put it against two estimates of atmospheric CO2 for the last 25 million years, that we see that, we're already, if you see the bottom line's 100, next tick is 200, next tick is 300. So, there's, for the last 220 million years, there's no evidence that it's ever been above, say, 394, where it is today. And so we're moving into territory that hasn't, just in terms of concentrations, that hasn't been seen for tens of millions of years, and rates of change that haven't been seen for considerably longer than that. So, what do we look to for analogs? And I think one of the analogs I look to, first of all, there's nothing in geologic time is like what we're doing, because there were never a civilization that went and transferred organic carbon from the sedimentary shell to the atmosphere before. But there have been extreme events in Earth's past, and one of them was the impact into the Yucatan that resulted in the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now there's some evidence, and it's not universally accepted, that there was a significant amount of calcium sulfate in this in the Yucatan that got volatilized by this impact and rained down in the ocean as sulfuric or sulfurous acid. And it may have caused a very short-lived acidification event. It could not have been long-lived because there just wouldn't have been enough release. So once it mixed into the deeper ocean, it would have not been a huge change in whole ocean chemistry. So if this was an acidification event, it's very different because it might have lasted for months or something like that instead of thousands of years, like our event is likely to act, but it also might have been more intense for that brief amount of time. But at that time, what's seen is basically most plankton that made shells or shells out of calcium carbonate disappeared. And there was selectivity that diatoms, which make shells out of silica glass-like material, seem to have done fairly well. Also, dinoflagellates, which leave a plastic-like cyst, seem to have done pretty well. And so, there was selectivity to the extinction where organisms that made shells or skeletons out of calcium carbonate minerals selectively went extinct. At that time, there was a loss of coral reefs around the world as well. And there are arguments about how long it took the reefs to come back, and this paper said less than 2 million years. It looks like there was a period of at least several 100,000 years where the reefs disappeared. Now, this is interesting for a few reasons. One is that as I said, that this acidification event, if it was indeed an acidification event, seems to probably would have lasted months or years at the outside because then the water would get diluted by deeper waters. And even if it was a more profound acidification event, we would expect the ocean chemistry to largely recover within a few tens of thousands of years, whereas the period for reefs to come back was much longer. And so it suggests that there's biological or ecological timescales for these ecosystems to reestablish themselves that are in the hundreds of thousands of years and possibly even in the millions of years. The other interesting thing is when the reefs came back, around half the species were species that existed before, about half the species that were around before the boundary came back after when the reefs reestablished themselves. And so that means that these corals were living as minor components of other ecosystems, and they might not have been building reefs, but they didn't necessarily go extinct. And I think this question about extinction and what we're doing now, if we continue with our current energy policies, that we might lose coral reefs. That doesn't mean we'll necessarily lose coral species, but there's lots of species, and it's been estimated that 25% or perhaps as much as 50% of marine species spend part of their life cycle in coral reefs. I'm skeptical about that higher number, but so the loss of the reefs, you might find that the coral species themselves survive, but that other organisms that depend on the reefs for part of their life cycle might be threatened. So the other, sort of just to keep our sense of time scales, that, there's been study looking at mass extinctions through Earth history, and that the time scale to regenerate the same level of biodiversity after a mass extinction is typically on the order of 10 million years. And so if we look at this sort of hundreds of thousands to millions of years time scale, it took several 100,000 years for the planktonic systems to redevelop. It took, longer than that probably for the coral reefs to become prevalent around the coast. And it took around 10 million years to get to the same level of biodiversity. And so the decisions that we're making about our energy policy over the next decades could potentially affect, biodiversity and what kinds of organisms are on this planet far into the future. And I don't have time to go into all of this, but there's some indication that many of the crises in Earth history have at least a component that is related to ocean acidification. As I said, there's no real analog, and every time there's all kinds of different things going on at once, and so it's I don't want to be single causal about these events, but just to say that it looks like ocean acidification played a role. I'll just jump past this figure and just say that, for example, this nice study by Andy Knoll looking at the end Permian mass extinction, that at the genus level, that organisms that had massive calcium carbonate skeletons and didn't control their internal water chemistry, 85% of those genera went extinct, whereas things like fish, where they have much more control of their internal chemistry and they don't make their skeletons out of calcium carbonate, only 1 out of 20 genera went extinct. And so, I think this at least indicates the kinds of patterns that we might see in the future. Not to say, I don't want to say that what we're doing is going to be as bad as the end Permian, but I think the idea that calcareous organisms that don't control their internal chemistry well and depend heavily on calcium carbonate shells or skeletons might be particularly vulnerable. This is some recent work, not yet published, led by my postdoc Kate Rickey. There's been recently a CMIP, what's called a CMIP-5 set of simulations, and this is most of the modeling groups in the world took what's called these representative concentration pathways and then ran their climate models. And a number of these groups also had full ocean, atmosphere, land surface carbon cycle models. And so there are now projections of ocean chemistry changes for these CMIP-5 models. And so Jim Orr did the calculations of the ocean chemistry, again, using a method similar to what we used earlier, as applying the model results to deviations from that GLODAP database, which was established by WOS for the mid-1990s. And so then Kate took those results and looked at, again, the reef base distribution of reefs and did more or less a similar study to what Longcow and I did a few years ago. And so, this is the, when people talk about 2 degrees warming, they need to specify when they're talking about 2 degrees above the 1990 or whatever, or above pre-industrial. But this is just showing that that RCP 4.5 is more or less 2 degrees above 1990s temperature, and the 2.6 one is a little bit less than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial. So, okay, so this is a figure. So it's the same kind of figures I showed you before. And so this the map is showing, as a function of the partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere, what the aragonite saturation level in the ocean is. And the bar chart on the right side is showing the fraction of reefs in each bin. And if you can see these, there's a few heavy lines between the reds and the blues. And so the, I don't know if I can get it from here, but this line here is 3.0. Oops, I'll wait for it to cycle around again. But the, anyway, right, so this heavy line is 3.5 saturation, 3.25, and 3.0. And so depending on how vulnerable you think reefs are to low saturation levels, you can think that one of those might represent a threshold for where reefs might be able to grow. And again, the numbers differ a little bit. Now, this is, I think, the mean model of all the CMIP-5 models that did these scenarios. And I think this is for the RCP 8.5 scenario. But the basic conclusion is the same, that when we're certainly by the time we're at the end of this century, there's no overlap left between the kind of water chemistry that surrounded coral reefs pre-industrially and the kind of water that would surround them later in the century if we fail to radically alter our energy policies. And so now we're going through this. So these 3 lines represent the 3 different thresholds for aragonite saturation. Again, there's uncertainty as to really how what saturation levels can sustainably support coral reefs. But in this analysis, there were no reefs pre-industrially that were surrounded by water. Open ocean water is less than omega aragonite of 3.25, and I think there was just a handful of reefs that were between 3.25 and 3.5 in terms of the open ocean water surrounding those coastal environments. And what this one shows is that even RCP 2.6, which, coming back to this, RCP 2.6 means, more or less, that means we're ramping out emissions by 2080 and really sucking CO2 back out of the atmosphere. So this is incredibly aggressive. Even this incredibly aggressive one, that if the saturation, critical threshold saturation of 3.5, that you're still losing half the reefs under that scenario. And some of the reefs, even with the more generous threshold. And so to say that it's similar to the thing with the lysocline rising all the way to the surface under 450 ppm, that even the sort of stabilization of 450 ppm is geologically unusual for ocean chemistry. Things get worse as you go to the RCP 4.5, and just to remind you what that is, that's more or less, not that far away from stabilizing emissions. It's stabilizing emissions and heading down, which is an incredibly optimistic pathway. Even under that incredibly optimistic pathway, if we're lucky on the omega aragonite threshold, we might, have 40% of the reefs still be sustainable. And so even under a optimistic type scenario, again, where you're more or less stabilizing CO2 and ramping down over the second half of the century, in the pessimistic case, we're losing almost all the reefs, and optimistically, we might have half of them left. But, if we go to a business as usual scenario, it doesn't matter. The uncertainty in what the threshold is that can sustain coral reefs almost doesn't matter, because they're going. So and this is just to stick them all on one plot. And so this is pretty close to business as usual as I see it. This maybe would be achievable if we did some Herculean effort. This one, is wishful. I mean, if I were king of the world, we might do that one, but short of that, it's not going to happen. And anyway, so things are looking dismal for the reefs, is what I would say. And so, one of the things that came out of this study is that if you lay all these have the same lines with all these RCP scenarios laying on top of each other, plotted as a function of partial pressure of CO2. And what you see is that the timing of release doesn't matter, and that is of secondary importance with regard to the ocean chemistry, that the surface ocean is very much in contact with the atmosphere, and so there can't be that much of a mismatch between the partial pressure of CO2 in the surface ocean and the partial pressure in the atmosphere. And so, especially in these tropical waters that are not in upwelling zones or not involving deep mixing, the surface water chemistry largely tracks the atmosphere. So you can collapse all three of these RCP scenarios onto a single figure by plotting on PCO2, and you can see that if the threshold is really something like 3.5. Then, more or less, by the time you're at a CO2 doubling, everything's gone. And, that it might be more like a tripling of CO2 if the threshold's at the lower end of what I would think is the uncertainty range. Now, there's also other things like global warming happening at the same time, and people have suggested that the bleaching is going to kill them off before the ocean acidification gets to. So I'll just end, I think, with this plot circling around. And so I think the upshot is that I think, just to come back to the original question, that my view is that at the edge of this range, for millions of years, corals have been trying to compete ecologically to compete successfully in lower saturation waters. And for millions of years, they have not been able to extend their range. And if you look at geologic time, and the work of Kiesling in Berlin is really key with this, that to a close approximation, the band at which corals grow has remained relatively constant with time. And if you thought that temperature was the main control, in the Cretaceous you'd expect to see all kinds of corals up at very high latitudes. But for the most part, corals have stayed, more or less within a band of plus or minus 35 degrees. And so I get from this that they've been trying, I don't want to anthropomorphize, but just in evolutionary time, that if it was possible for reefs to adapt and thrive and compete ecologically at lower saturation levels, they would have been doing that at the edge of the range today. And so, some people think, okay, we'll give a few decades. If we go to a lower emissions, we emit slightly slower, it'll give them a few more decades to adapt. Well, I think they've been trying to, I don't want to anthropomorphize that they don't try to do things, but that there's been, a pressure for them to adapt to lower saturation conditions throughout geologic time, and they haven't succeeded in competing in that. And so I think the idea that they're going to somehow undergo some kind of massive evolutionary leap and suddenly be able to live in waters that they've never lived in before, I think is a bit unrealistic. And so I don't think we can really say with any certainty of what will survive and what will go extinct. But I think that it's I think under a business as usual scenario, it's at least likely that coral reefs will not be sustainable and they won't go away right away. It might take a storm, a disease, or something else to knock out a reef, and then seagrasses or something else will repopulate that space later. And and I think that the reefs are an extreme case because the basic architecture of the ecosystem is by one class of organisms that build skeletons out of a particularly soluble form of calcium carbonate. If you think of the open ocean systems where you have calcareous plankton, that some of them might be negatively, or many of them might be negatively impacted, but they're not building the fundamental architecture of the ecosystem. And there are other situations that I think that we're just in a situation with great uncertainty. For example, there was a paper last week or a week before about looking in the Southern Ocean where pteropods, a kind of marine snail with a calcium carbonate shell was found in undersaturated, the organisms were found in undersaturated waters with their shells dissolving. And now that saturation level, it's thought that only 0.1 of that change in saturation was due to anthropogenic climate change, but it suggests that, so that means that these undersaturated waters were probably appearing with lesser frequency in the past, and still these shells of the organisms were dissolving there. So if these kind of low saturation conditions have been occurring and the organisms didn't adapt to thrive in those, do we really think they're going to adapt and thrive in the coming decades? So maybe with that cheery note, I'll stop.
Thank you. There is another unrelated session coming in here starting at 5 o'clock, so we have 5 minutes for questions. I would ask that the people that can recognize that you speak loud so that we can get your voice on the audio, and if maybe Ken can paraphrase your question as part of his answer. And I say we have 5 minutes. I'll leave it to you to choose.
Peter?
Beautiful summary, Ken. I really enjoyed it. I'm depressed, of course, but it's good. You only showed 3 RCPs. RCP 6 was missing. Never think that's quite likely. One question. The other is, were those scenarios fossil fuel only, or did you add in terms for additional respiratory CO2 from warming and microbial?
Yeah, those were the full RCP scenarios, which were done as I believe they were done as concentration pathways, and they had concentrations for all the different gases. So, but I think the way I'm not sure of the details of how these were designed, I think the RCPs, probably somebody else in here can answer this better, had defined concentrations, and so then these carbon cycle feedbacks would impact back on what emissions you would predict would produce those concentrations. And so we did the analysis for RCP6 also, but not very few modeling groups with an ocean carbon cycle model did that scenario. So since these were labor-intensive simulations, very few groups did RCP6. this over here.
I think you mentioned that there were times in the past when the reefs disappeared, and then they reappear. So how did that happen? Did some of the same lineages survive and non-reef form for a while, or is it like convergent evolution of new reef-forming species?
No, it's as far as anybody can tell, which is probably morphologically, it's the same. 50% of the species that were around, say, before the end Cretaceous boundary came back when reefs came back. And so, since there's no fossils of them in that interval, nobody really knows. But the hypothesis is that they form minor components of other ecosystems, so that you lost reefs as an ecosystem, but you didn't lose corals as species. Let me go all the way to the back. Well, this is a sort of deep type question. Yeah, what was the question? The question is, what if reefs disappear, what does that mean? Or to summarize, not put words in your mouth, it's like, well, who cares? And the standard answer is, that there are vulnerable communities of poor people who depend on them for fish and nutrients, and there's numbers of how many hundreds of millions of people depend on reefs for their livelihood and tourism and all this kind of stuff. And then there's the other sort of standard answer is, this is a necessary component of, the homeostatic Earth system, and if we lose these, that humans are the next domino to fall. I personally don't believe any of that. I actually think if you sterilize the ocean, yes, vulnerable people would be hurt, poor people would be hurt, but that, we'd still have chicken McNuggets and TV shows and basically would be okay, So, and so for me, it's really this sort of tragedy, and maybe this is a middle-class American viewpoint, but that that you've had billions of years of evolution producing all this biodiversity, and because we want to have economists estimate it might cost something like 2% of GDP to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions from our energy system. Maybe it'll cost a few percent more of GDP. And so because we want to be a few percent richer, we're willing to lose all of this, all of these ecosystems. We're willing to lose the Arctic ecosystem. We're willing to lose these marine ecosystems. And to me, it's a little bit like somebody saying, well, I have enough money so I can run through the Metropolitan Museum and just slash up all the paintings. And so for me, being a middle-class American who's going to have TV shows and chicken McNuggets and burgers and things, that for me, it's more of this kind of ethical kind of thing. Obviously, if you depend on your livelihood for fishing on a reef, you're going to have a different perspective, but anyway, that's enough babble there, right?
I'd like to take the chair's prerogative to ask the last question, and then I guess we will have to leave because there's other people coming in. Presumably, there are some species of coral that are less sensitive to the changes in the saturation ratio. Is there any evidence to date, or is there research underway to see if some species are starting to take over and dominate reefs that are under stress and might actually survive for some period of time more than what would expected otherwise?
Yeah, there are reefs that live in lower saturation waters, and so this question is, could those species that dominate those reefs extend everywhere else? And I think that can't be excluded. We see species that are in the, say, Indo-Pacific that are not in the Atlantic and vice versa. And so even though these basins are connected by water, and you'd think over millions of years some polyps should have gotten around, that the actual evidence for corals moving great distances and repopulating other areas is low. And it might be that hundreds of thousands of years time scale for coming back from the end Cretaceous might be the time scale for doing that kind of repopulation.
Well, let's thank our speaker again. I will remind the audience that this talk and the two previous ones will be available for viewing on the AGU website within about 48 hours, and you can get direct links to all three at the Global Environmental Change website, gec.agu.org. Thank you all.